I was hired the way one hires furniture, quietly, efficiently, and with the clear expectation that I would not speak unless spoken to. That alone should have warned her she was about to make a mistake. Humans don't do quiet very well, and we do forgettable, even worse. The invitation arrived sealed in a crest heavy enough to dent my table, delivered by a servant who wouldn't meet my eyes and spoke my language like it tasted strange. The message was brief. Attend. Obey. Be presentable. Payment generous. Duration limited. No emotional complications. I laughed out loud at that last part, alone in my quarters, because anyone who thinks emotions can be contractually prohibited has never hired a human. Her estate sat high above the city, all polished stone and hovering banners, a monument to lineage and entitlement. I could feel the eyes on me the moment I stepped through the gates. Humans were rare here, and not the kind of rare people admired. We were tools, novelties, or warnings. I straightened my jacket anyway. Old habit. If you're going to be judged, give them something worth staring at. She met me in a private chamber that smelled faintly of unfamiliar incense and authority. Tall, composed, draped in fabrics that probably cost more than my ship. Every movement precise. Every expression controlled. When she looked at me, it wasn't curiosity. It was assessment. She explained the problem without embarrassment. Her rank attracted suitors the way blood attracts predators. Powerful ones. Persistent ones. Tradition dictated that an unattached noblewoman was open to challenge, persuasion, or conquest through marriage. A mate, even a temporary one, closed that door. Permanently bonded or not didn't matter. Appearance did. I was to be the appearance. Her expectations were refreshingly low. I would stand beside her. I would touch her hand when required. I would not speak unless protocol demanded it. I would not initiate contact. I would not draw attention. She stressed that last point twice, as if attention were something one could simply decide not to attract. I signed the contract while she watched my hand like she expected me to steal the stylus. When I looked up, she was already turning away, satisfied. Hired. Contained. Forgettable. The first event was that same evening. A gathering of nobles whose smiles were sharp enough to cut glass. I stood half a step behind her, exactly as instructed, eyes forward, posture relaxed. I didn't need to know their customs to understand the game. They were circling. Measuring. Looking for weakness. I felt it before I saw it, the shift in the room when they noticed me properly. Not the uniform, not the species. The calm. Humans learn early that confidence is cheaper than armor and often more effective. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just comfortable in my own skin, and apparently that was exotic. Someone laughed at a joke I hadn't told. A servant lingered a moment too long when offering a drink. A nobleman glanced at me instead of her and then frowned, confused by his own reaction. I caught her watching it all from the corner of her eye, irritation flickering beneath composure. She tightened her grip on my arm, just slightly. Possessive already, though she wouldn't have named it that. To her, I was a symbol, and symbols should behave. A rival approached, all silk and smugness, and addressed her with the kind of courtesy that drips condescension. I stayed silent, as ordered, but I met his eyes when he glanced at me dismissively. Didn't stare. Didn't challenge. Just acknowledged him as an equal. His step faltered. Humans are good at that too, making people feel seen when they least expect it. By the time the gathering ended, whispers followed us like a second set of footsteps. Back in her private chambers, she dismissed the servants and turned on me with narrowed eyes. "You were noticed," she said. "I stood," I replied. "Technically within the rules." She studied me again, slower this time, as if recalculating. I could almost hear the mental adjustments grinding into place. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I was supposed to be background noise, not a variable. She reminded me of the boundaries. Professional. Temporary. Political. I agreed easily. Humans know when to let silence do the work. It unsettles people who are used to control. As I was shown to my quarters, servants smiled at me. Not polite smiles. Real ones. I smiled back. It costs nothing and pays dividends. Lying awake later, staring at a ceiling that probably had a name and a history, I considered the situation. She wanted a shield. She had hired a mirror instead, something that reflected the attention she was used to commanding and bent it sideways. I hadn't done anything yet. That was the funniest part. Tomorrow would be worse. Or better. Depends who you asked. I fell asleep wondering how long it would take before she realized the problem wasn't the suitors anymore. I noticed it first in the way servants stopped pretending I wasn't there. A pause before speaking. A second glance. Someone adjusted my collar without being asked, and then flushed when they realized what they'd done. I thanked them anyway. That seemed to confuse them more than rudeness ever could. She summoned me early, already dressed in layers of formality, expressions smooth and unreadable. She informed me we would be attending a series of social obligations throughout the day. I was reminded, again, of my role. Stand close. Say nothing. Observe protocol. Be decorative. Decorative was apparently a flexible term. The first visit was a ceremonial greeting with a cluster of minor nobles who had apparently spent the night rehearsing how unimpressed they would be. I stood where I was told, hands relaxed, gaze neutral. One of them began reciting lineage at her, voice swelling with self-importance. I watched her shoulders stiffen almost imperceptibly. When the speech finally ended, there was a pause that felt like a held breath. I inclined my head. Just a little. Respectful. Human. The speaker blinked, thrown off rhythm. Someone else snorted before they could stop themselves. The tension cracked, just enough for conversation to slip sideways into something less rigid. She glanced at me sharply, then continued as if nothing had happened, but her steps were quicker when we left. By the third engagement, word had spread. I could feel it in the curious glances, the way conversation subtly angled toward me like plants seeking light. I still wasn't speaking much, but when addressed directly, I answered simply. No flourish. No submission either. Just honesty. It unsettled them more than arrogance ever could. At one point, a noblewoman with elaborate jewelry and a sharper smile asked her, pointedly, where she had acquired me. The phrasing was deliberate. Ownership implied? I waited, curious. She replied without hesitation that I was hers. Temporary, implied but not stated. The noblewoman's eyes flicked to me again, evaluating. Does he behave? I smiled before I could stop myself. Not wide. Not smug. Just amused. The noblewoman flushed. She excused herself shortly after. When we were alone, she hissed at me that I was not supposed to provoke anyone. I didn't, I said. I smiled. That is provoking. She snapped, then stopped, clearly irritated at herself. The real trouble started at the midday court ritual, a labyrinth of rules and performative politeness designed to exhaust participants into mistakes. Humans thrive on those. We call them meetings. While others struggled to remember the correct sequence of gestures, I followed her lead and mirrored her movements with relaxed precision. Not perfect, but confident. Confidence forgives imperfection. A challenger finally stepped forward. Older. Wealthier. Smiling like a blade. He questioned the legitimacy of our bond with all the subtlety of a hammer wrapped in velvet. The room leaned in. She answered with clipped formality, but I could feel the tension in her arm where it rested against mine. Without thinking, I shifted closer. Not defensive. Supportive. The difference matters. I met the challenger's gaze calmly. Didn't glare. Didn't bow. He faltered. Just a fraction. Long enough for the audience to notice. Long enough for murmurs to ripple. The challenger retreated, dignity dented. Afterward, she didn't speak to me for nearly an hour. When she finally did, it was to issue stricter instructions. Less eye contact. Less smiling. Less presence, if that was possible. She framed it as concern for political stability. I agreed, because arguing would have been pointless. Humans also know when to let inevitability do the arguing. By evening, the estate buzzed. Invitations arrived faster than they could be refused. Servants speculated openly. Guards greeted me with nods instead of indifference. I caught her watching it all, irritation tangled with something else. Something sharper. Something personal. At a reception that night, someone else laughed at something I said quietly to a servant. That laughter spread. She turned toward the sound, eyes narrowing, and stepped between me and the growing circle of interest without even realizing she'd done it. Later, alone again, she confronted me. Accused me of enjoying this too much. I didn't deny it. There was no point. Humans enjoy competence, and I was apparently very competent at existing. She insisted this was still an arrangement. A tool. A shield. I agreed. Again. But this time, the words felt thinner stretched. As I returned to my quarters, I passed a pair of servants arguing softly about me. One insisted I was dangerous. The other said I was refreshing. I smiled to myself. That was usually the point where things got interesting. I lay awake longer that night. Not because of worry, but because I could feel the trajectories shifting. She had hired silence. She had acquired noise. And tomorrow, the aristocracy would push harder, curious to see how far the human anomaly would bend. I suspected I wouldn't. The shift happened quietly, the way dangerous things usually do. She stopped correcting my posture. It was subtle at first. A hand that didn't immediately pull away after a public touch. Instructions that came later than usual, delivered with irritation instead of certainty. She still spoke like someone in control, but control was no longer effortless. It had weight now. The aristocracy noticed. Of course they did. They always notice cracks before collapses. The next gathering was smaller, more intimate, which somehow made it worse. Fewer witnesses meant sharper scrutiny. Eyes lingered. Smiles thinned. I felt it when someone stood too close, when a question meant for her angled toward me instead. I answered politely and briefly, just enough to be human, not enough to invite anything further. That should have been enough. It wasn't. A younger noble, ambitious, reckless, and far too confident in his own importance, attempted what others hadn't dared. He complimented me directly. Not my utility. Not my obedience. Me. My presence. My composure. The room went still in that expectant way crowds get when they smell blood or scandal. I didn't have time to respond. Her hand tightened around my wrist, not ceremonial this time. Not gentle either. Possessive. Her voice was cool as she reminded him, publicly and unmistakably, that I was bonded to her and therefore unavailable for admiration, inquiry, or challenge. The noble flushed and backed away, chastened. The silence afterward was loud. She didn't look at me again until we were alone. When the doors sealed behind us, the mask cracked. Not shattered. Cracked. Enough to let something raw leak through. "You are making this difficult," she said. "For them," I replied. "For me," she corrected sharply, then exhaled as if annoyed with herself. "You were meant to be a solution. You are becoming a complication." I leaned against the table instead of standing at attention. That alone earned me a look. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." She stared at me like she was deciding whether to be offended or intrigued. It took her longer than she liked. She accused me of encouraging attention. Of enjoying it. I didn't deny that part. Humans enjoy being appreciated, especially when it's accidental. I told her I wasn't doing anything she hadn't allowed. I followed her rules. Mostly. That word hung between us. She dismissed me abruptly. Not angrily. Uneasily. The days that followed were stranger than the chaos before. Fewer events. More private moments. Meals where she waved away attendance and spoke to me like a person instead of a prop. Questions slipped out, about Earth, about humans, about whether confidence was taught or innate. I answered honestly. Humans rarely get asked those questions by people who matter. One night stretched longer than it should have. Conversation wandered. Humor crept in. I made her laugh before she realized what was happening. It startled both of us. She covered it quickly, but not before I saw the relief beneath it. Laughter wasn't common in her world. It wasn't efficient. It didn't reinforce hierarchy. It felt good anyway. The trouble was, she started looking at me differently afterward. Less like a possession. More like a threat, to herself. When another invitation arrived, one that explicitly requested my presence, she tore it in half without consulting me. The sound was sharp. Final. She noticed my raised brow and bristled. "They are not entitled to you," she said. "I didn't say they were. You didn't have to," she snapped, then paused. "You are under my protection." There it was. The word she'd avoided before. I told her protection wasn't ownership. Not to humans. That landed badly. Pride flared. Voices rose. She accused me of forgetting my place. I reminded her she'd hired a partner, not a shadow. The argument burned hot and brief, leaving something dangerous in its wake: honesty. She admitted she didn't like the way others looked at me. Didn't like how easily I fit into her world. Didn't like how natural it felt to rely on me. Those admissions cost her. I could see it. Each one stripped away a layer of armor she'd spent a lifetime forging. I told her reliance wasn't weakness. That choosing someone wasn't the same as losing control. Humans build bonds differently. We don't pretend we're untouchable. We just decide who gets close. That quiet that followed was heavier than any argument. The next event sealed it. A senior noble publicly questioned whether our bond was genuine or merely convenient. Before I could react, she answered. Loudly. Clearly. She declared exclusivity, not as strategy but as statement. No qualifiers. No politics. The room froze. I turned to her, surprised. So was she. The realization hit her a second later. She had crossed a line she couldn't retreat from without humiliation. Without loss. She looked at me then, searching for something: approval, anger, reassurance. I gave her none of it. Not yet. That night, alone in my quarters, I understood the real problem. The act was over for her. She just hadn't admitted it yet. And tomorrow, I would have to decide whether it was over for me too. The estate woke to silence that morning, the kind that follows a declaration no one expected and everyone heard. Servants moved carefully. Guards watched me differently. Word had spread faster than light ever should. Exclusivity wasn't just personal here, it was political. And she had claimed it without consulting the one person it affected most. She sent for me before the first meal. There was no audience this time. No armor of ceremony. She stood by the tall windows, looking out over a city that had bent itself around her name for generations. When she turned, the confidence was there, but it was strained now, stretched thin by something dangerously close to honesty. She didn't start with commands. She started with an explanation. She said the suitors were finished. No one would challenge her bond now. Her position was secure. The problem, my purpose, had been resolved. She spoke like someone reciting a victory report, expecting acknowledgement. I let the silence sit. Finally, I asked her what she intended to do next. She frowned, just slightly. "You will remain?" Not asked? Not offered. Declared. I told her that wasn't how it worked for humans. That contracts ended. Roles concluded. Choices were mutual, or they were nothing at all. The words landed like a fracture. She bristled, pride rising to defend itself, but it faltered halfway up. She admitted she hadn't considered that I might leave. That was the truth beneath everything. She never had to consider it before. People stayed because status demanded it, because fear encouraged it, because tradition enforced it. She had never needed someone to choose her. I told her I hadn't been hired to disappear into her life. I'd been hired to stand beside her. Those were different things. One was obedience. The other was partnership. Humans were particular about that distinction. She argued. Briefly. Then stopped. The fight drained out of her all at once, leaving something unguarded behind. She confessed she had enjoyed the laughter, the ease, the way I treated her like a person instead of a symbol. She confessed she didn't know how to ask for more without losing face. I told her face could be rebuilt. Trust was harder. The estate council convened that afternoon, drawn by curiosity and panic in equal measure. I stood beside her again, not because I was told to, but because I chose to. That difference changed everything. When questioned, she didn't answer for me. She looked at me. I spoke then. Calmly. Clearly. I said I was no one's possession. That I was here because I wanted to be, not because I was owned. The room reacted exactly as expected: shock, outrage, fascination. Humans had a talent for disrupting systems just by stating obvious truths. She didn't interrupt. That mattered. When it was over, when the council retreated to argue among themselves, she turned to me with something close to uncertainty. I told her my contract was finished. That if I stayed, it would be as her partner, not her shield. She nodded once. Not in command. In acceptance. That night, the estate felt different. Lighter. We walked its halls without ceremony, without witnesses, speaking freely. She laughed again, unguarded this time, and didn't try to hide it. She asked me to stay, not as an order, not as tradition, but as a request. I agreed. The aristocracy would adapt. They always did. Traditions bent. Power redefined itself. What mattered was that the act was over. What remained was real, chosen, and inconveniently human. She had wanted silence. She had hired obedience. What she received was partnership. And she wouldn't trade it for anything.